Get comfortable. Pull the covers up, close your eyes, and let everything else drift away. Ziz, you're in the right place. The stadium lights have dimmed. The crowds have gone home. But the stories never stop. And tonight, here is a great one. Picture a narrow street in East Belfast. Terraced houses pressed close together. The kind of street where every door knows every other door. Where a ball bouncing against a gable wall is simply the sound of the evening arriving. The year is the early 1950s. The city carries the marks of a hard recent history, rebuilding itself quietly, and in among the ordinary streets of the Craiger estate there is a small boy who cannot sit still unless there is a ball somewhere near his feet. He is not the biggest boy on the street. He is not the loudest, but there is something in the way he moves. Something his neighbours will spend the rest of their lives trying to describe accurately and never quite managing, because the words available to ordinary speech were not built for what he could do with a ball and a few square yards of tarmac. This is a story about genius. It is also a story about what genius costs the person carrying it. Both of those things are true at once, and neither one cancels out the other, and by the end of tonight you will understand why the two of them were never able to live apart. Let the evening settle around you. Let your body grow heavy. There is nowhere else you need to be, and nothing else you need to do except listen. Here is where it begins. George Best is born in Belfast in May of 1946, the eldest of 6 children, into a family that is loving and steady and entirely unremarkable in every way except for the boy himself. His father works at the shipyard, the great cranes of Harland and Wolff visible from certain streets in the city, the kind of steady industrial work that shaped a whole generation of Belfast families. His mother keeps the house and raises the children with the quiet, unfussy competence of a woman who has more to do in a day than there are hours to do it in. They live on the Craiger estate, a modest housing development on the eastern edge of the city, rows of pebble-dashed houses with small gardens and narrow streets, built to give working families a decent place to live after the war. It is not a poor place in the way that some places are poor, not dust and rubble and desperation. It is simply ordinary, solid, the kind of place where nobody expects anything extraordinary to happen, and everybody is proven wrong by one particular child. From the very beginning, George cannot be parted from a ball. His mother will tell people, later, once the whole world wants to know what he was like as a boy, that he would take a ball to bed with him some nights, that he would kick a ball against the gable end of the house for hours, until the neighbours grew so used to the rhythmic thud of leather on brick that they stopped hearing it at all, the way you stop hearing a clock ticking in your own home. He is small for his age, slight, almost fragile looking, with a mop of dark hair that will later become as recognisable as any footballer's face in the world. But what he lacks in size he makes up for in something else entirely, something that the other children on the estate notice long before any adult with real football knowledge ever claps eyes on him. He can do things with a ball that make no sense. He can control it as though it is tied to his foot with an invisible thread. He can go past boys 3 years older than him, boys with longer legs and heavier frames, and he does it not through strength, but through something closer to sleight of hand, a drop of the shoulder, a change of pace that exists in the smallest of margins, a body that seems to know, instinctively, exactly where every defender's weight is committed, and exactly which direction offers the gap. The street becomes his classroom, Craiger Road, the entries between the houses, the tarmac playground at his primary school. Wherever there is a flat surface and something round to kick, George is there, morning until dark, teaching himself a version of football that no coach has shown him, and that no coach really ever could have shown him, because what he is developing is not a set of techniques so much as a relationship between his feet and the ball, between his eyes and the spaces other people cannot see. There is a particular kind of childhood talent that hides in plain sight for years before anyone in authority notices it, simply because nobody with the right kind of eyes happens to be looking in the right place at the right time. George's talent does not hide for very long. Word travels. It travels the way word always travels in a tight community, mouth to mouth. This boy on the Craiger estate, you should see him, he's not like the others, and eventually it reaches the ears of a man named Bob Bishop, a scout working, unofficially, and then increasingly officially, for Manchester United, a club that by the mid-1950s has already built a reputation in Britain for finding young talent and trusting it. for handing first-team football to teenagers when other clubs would have made them wait years. Bob Bishop watches George play in a schoolboy match, and what he sees convinces him immediately that he has found something rare. He is not a man given to exaggeration. Scouts who exaggerate do not last long in the job, because clubs learn quickly not to trust their judgment. But when Bob Bishop sends his report back to Manchester United, back to the manager, a Scotsman named Matt Busby, who has already built one great Manchester United team and lost most of it in tragedy, the words he uses are the kind of words that scouts say for the rarest of occasions. "I think I've found you a genius." It is not a phrase Bishop uses lightly, and it is not a phrase that Busby, a man who has seen a great deal of football and a great many players over a long career, is inclined to dismiss. Arrangements are made. George Best, 15 years old, is invited across the water to Manchester for a trial. What happens next is one of those stories that becomes part of football folklore, precisely because it reveals something true about the enormous gap between talent and readiness, between what a boy can do with a ball and what it actually feels like to be a boy, alone, a long way from home, for the first time in his life. He travels to Manchester with another young hopeful, a boy named Eric McMordy, and the two of them arrive in a city that is louder and greyer and considerably less familiar than anything either of them has known. They are billeted with a landlady, a kind woman who does her best to make them comfortable, but comfort is not really the issue. The issue is homesickness, a specific and overwhelming ache that neither boy has fully anticipated, a feeling that settles into the chest and refuses to loosen no matter how well anyone treats you. It is worth pausing on this, because it is easy, decades later, knowing everything that George Best would go on to achieve, to imagine that greatness like his arrived pre-packaged with confidence, with certainty, with the kind of hardened self-assurance that lets a person walk into any new situation and simply belong there. It did not. What arrived in Manchester in the 15th year of George Best's life was a homesick boy who missed his mother and his father and his 5 younger siblings and the particular sound of his own street, and who found the enormous unfamiliar sprawl of an English industrial city almost unbearable. Within days, the two boys decide they cannot stay. They do not tell anyone. They simply gather what little they have and make their way back to the docks, and they take the ferry home to Belfast, slipping away from the trial that thousands of young footballers across Britain would have given almost anything to be offered, because the pull of home is, in that moment, simply stronger than the pull of opportunity. It would have been easy at this point for the story to end there. Plenty of clubs, faced with a boy who ran home from his own trial without a word of explanation, would have crossed his name off the list and moved on to the next prospect. Football has never had any shortage of talented boys, and talent that cannot commit to staying is, from a certain hard-nosed footballing perspective, talent that is not worth the trouble. But Matt Busby is not a man who gives up easily on a talent he believes in, and Bob Bishop's report has stayed with him. There is something about the way Bishop described this particular boy, something in the specific choice of the word genius, that makes Busby unwilling to simply let it go. He writes to the family. He is patient in a way that few managers in professional football have ever been patient, understanding, somehow, that what he is dealing with here is not laziness or lack of commitment, but simply the ordinary, understandable homesickness of a child who has been asked to grow up several years faster than he is ready for. George is persuaded to try again, and this time with a little more preparation, a little more understanding on both sides of what the adjustment will actually require, he stays. Barely. There will be more moments of doubt, more nights when the ache for home threatens to send him back across the water for good, but gradually, through the patient management of people at the club who understand that this particular boy needs handling with more care than most, George Best begins to settle into life in Manchester. What nobody quite realises yet, not Busby, not Bishop, not even the club itself, is that they have found something that will not simply be a very good footballer. They have found the player who will change what English football imagines is possible from a single individual, who will make the boys who came before him look, in retrospect, slightly ordinary by comparison. But that is still some way off. For now, there is only a 15-year-old boy in digs in Manchester, learning to be away from home, learning the discipline of a football club that expects excellence in training as well as on match day, learning slowly that the same instincts that made him magical on the tarmac of Cregger Road translate, with the right nurturing, into something the whole football world will eventually stop and stare at. He trains with the other apprentices. He does the jobs that all young players at the club are expected to do in that era: cleaning boots, sweeping the terraces, learning humility alongside technique, because Manchester United in this period believes, as a matter of philosophy, that even the most talented boys must first learn what it means to serve the club before the club will let them represent it. George does the work. He is quiet by most accounts, watchful, still finding his feet in a country and a culture that is not quite his own despite sharing a language and nominally a set of islands. And on the training pitch, where the watching eyes belong to coaches who have seen genuine world-class talent before and know exactly what it looks like, the whispers begin almost immediately. This one is different. This one is not simply good. This one might be the best they have ever seen. To understand what George Best is walking into at Manchester United, you need to understand what happened to the club just a few years before he arrived, because it explains everything about the weight of expectation that settles onto young players there and about the particular tenderness with which Matt Busby treats the talent in his care. In February of 1958, a plane carrying the Manchester United team back from a European match crashed on takeoff at Munich airport, in the snow and slush of a botched runway. 8 of the club's players died, young men, several of them barely out of their teens, part of a side so gifted and so youthful that the newspapers had already nicknamed them the Busby Babes. Busby himself was gravely injured, given the last rites twice, and it was for a long time genuinely uncertain whether he would survive at all, let alone return to management. He did survive, and he did return, and the rebuilding of Manchester United after Munich becomes one of the defining projects of his life, a slow and painstaking reconstruction of a club that had lost not just players but a piece of its soul on a runway in Germany. Every young talent that comes through the door in the years that follow carries just a little of that history with them, whether they realise it or not, because Busby is a man who has learned in the most brutal way imaginable exactly how fragile and precious footballing greatness actually is, and exactly how quickly it can be taken away. This is the context into which George Best arrives. A club rebuilding itself around a manager who has been to the edge of his own mortality and back, who has buried players he loved like sons, and who is now, cautiously, patiently, assembling a new generation capable of restoring what was lost. By the time George is old enough to break into the first team, that new generation already includes 2 players who will become as central to his story as anyone in football. The first is Bobby Charlton, a survivor of the Munich crash itself, a midfielder of extraordinary range and a right foot capable of scoring goals from distances that seem faintly absurd, a man carrying his own private grief about that night in Germany with a dignity that never once slips into public view. The second is Denis Law, a Scottish forward signed from Italian football, sharp-tongued, quick-witted, blessed with a predatory instinct in front of goal and a flair for the dramatic that matches anything George himself will bring to the club. Together, once George forces his way into the side, the 3 of them will become known across English football as the Holy Trinity. Best, Law and Charlton, 3 entirely different kinds of genius sharing the same forward line, the same era, the same club. At the same time, a concentration of individual brilliance that Manchester football has rarely seen before or since. George makes his first team debut in September of 1963, 17 years old, against West Bromwich Albion. It is not, by most accounts, a debut that announces him to the wider football world in the way his talent deserves. He plays reasonably well, unremarkably well, the kind of performance that suggests promise without yet suggesting genius. He is dropped back to the reserves afterward, given more time to develop physically to add the strength and stamina that will let his skill survive the rougher realities of English top-flight football, where defenders in this era are permitted, and often expected, to use methods considerably more physical than anything modern football would tolerate. But it does not take long. Within a year, George is a regular in the first team, and the performances begin to accumulate in a way that makes it impossible for anyone watching English football closely to ignore him. He has a low centre of gravity, extraordinary balance, a body that seems able to absorb heavy challenges and simply keep moving as though nothing has happened. He can beat a man on either side, he can finish with either foot, he has pace that catches full-backs cold, and a dribbling style that borders on the theatrical, all feints and drops of the shoulder, and sudden devastating changes of direction that leave defenders grasping at space where the ball used to be. Crowds begin to come to Old Trafford specifically to see him, not simply to see Manchester United, the great famous club rebuilding itself after tragedy, but to see this one particular teenager do things with a football that nobody in an English shirt has quite done before. There is a joy to his play that audiences respond to instinctively, an unmistakable sense that he is enjoying himself out there, that football is, for him, still fundamentally the same thing it was on the tarmac of Cregar Road. Play, pure, uncomplicated play, elevated to a level that happens to be worth paying money to watch. The press, always hungry for a news story, begin to notice him too, though in these early years the coverage is still mostly about football rather than about the life beyond it. Reporters describe his balance, his trickery, his astonishing composure for someone so young. They note, with a kind of bemused admiration, that he seems entirely unbothered by the reputations of the defenders sent to stop him, treating grizzled, battle-hardened professionals with the same casual confidence he once showed the older boys on his own street. There is something else beginning to stir in these years too, something that will eventually become as large a part of his story as anything that happens on a football pitch. George is strikingly good-looking, in a way that photographs well and translates easily into the kind of attention that footballers of previous generations never had to contend with. The 1960s are transforming British culture at a startling pace, and George Best, with his cheekbones and his dark eyes and his fashionable haircut, looks less like the footballers who came before him, and rather more like the pop stars beginning to dominate the covers of magazines up and down the country. Nobody quite realises it yet, but the ingredients are all assembling themselves. Extraordinary football talent, genuine matinee idol looks, a country entering one of the most culturally explosive decades of the century, and a young man from Belfast who has not yet turned 20, still learning who he is, about to be handed a level of fame that almost nobody in British sport has ever experienced before, and that almost nobody could reasonably be expected to handle without difficulty. For now, though, the story is still mostly about football, and the football in these years is extraordinary enough on its own terms to have made George Best a legend, even if nothing else about his life had ever happened at all. In March of 1966, Manchester United travelled to Lisbon for a European Cup quarter-final against Benfica, the great Portuguese club, twice European champions in the previous 6 years, built around a forward line containing one of the finest players on the entire continent, a Mozambican-born striker whose name will forever be linked, in different ways, with the story you heard a while back about a boy from Buenos Aires. That striker's name is Eusebio, and Benfica, on their own ground in front of a passionate home crowd, are expected by almost everyone in European football to be simply too strong for the young English side. Manchester United arrive in Lisbon holding a narrow lead from the first leg, a single goal advantage that most observers consider fragile at best, against a Benfica team unbeaten at home in international competition for several years. The stadium is full, the noise is enormous, and the assumption inside Portugal, and indeed across most of the football world, is that the home side will overturn the deficit comfortably. Nobody has accounted for George Best. What happens in the opening minutes of that match becomes one of the defining performances of his career, a 20-minute spell of individual brilliance so complete and so devastating that it effectively ends the tie as a contest before most of the crowd have properly settled into their seats. He scores twice inside the first 12 minutes. The first a looping header that catches the Benfica goalkeeper badly positioned, the second a dazzling solo run that begins deep in his own half and ends with the ball in the net, defenders trailing behind him like men chasing a wind they cannot catch. By the time 20 minutes have passed, Manchester United are 3 goals up on the night, and the match, ostensibly one of the most difficult fixtures in European football that season, has been transformed into a procession. The final score finishes 5-1 to Manchester United, an almost unthinkable result away from home against a team of Benfica's pedigree, and the story of the match in every newspaper across Britain the following morning is not really about the team at all. It is about the teenager who tore the game apart virtually single-handedly in its opening exchanges, a 19-year-old boy from a Belfast housing estate who has just announced himself, in the most emphatic possible terms, on the biggest stage European football has to offer. There is a photograph taken after the match that becomes, almost instantly, one of the most reproduced images in the history of British sport. A local shop, or perhaps an enterprising photographer, one of the accounts vary, presents George with a wide-brimmed sombrero, a nod to the flamboyance of his performance, and George, always comfortable in front of a camera in a way that few footballers of his generation ever quite managed, puts it on and grins for the picture. The image is everywhere within days. It captures something that the football writers of the era do not quite have the language for yet, because nothing in English football has prepared them for a footballer who looks, and increasingly behaves, less like a traditional sportsman and rather more like one of the pop stars currently dominating the cultural conversation in Britain. The comparison writes itself, and one newspaper, reaching for a headline that will stick permanently to George Best for the remainder of his career and long beyond it, dubs him El Beatle, a nod to both his Lisbon heroics and his uncanny resemblance, in cheekbones and haircut if nothing else, to the four musicians from Liverpool who are, at this exact moment, the most famous young men in the world. The nickname sticks because it is accurate in a way that goes beyond the joke of it. George Best returns from Lisbon not simply as a brilliant young footballer who has had one outstanding night in Portugal, but as something closer to a genuine national celebrity, recognised on streets far beyond the football grounds of England, invited to events and parties that no footballer before him had ever really been invited to, treated by the press with the same breathless, obsessive attention that had previously been reserved almost exclusively for musicians and film stars. It is worth sitting with this moment for a while, because it represents a genuine hinge point, not just in George's career, but in the entire relationship between football and fame in Britain. Before Lisbon, footballers were, for the most part, working men who happened to be extremely good at a working man's game, respected and admired within the world of football, but rarely treated as cultural figures in the way that actors or musicians were treated. After Lisbon, George Best begins to occupy a different kind of space entirely, one that had simply never existed before for an English or Irish footballer, a space where football skill and matinee idol fame become inseparable from one another, feeding each other, each making the other larger. Nobody at the club, not even Matt Busby, who has more experience than almost anyone alive in managing exceptionally gifted young men, has a template for what comes next. There is no precedent. There is no established way of protecting a 20-year-old from a level of public attention that had, until this point in history, simply never been directed at a professional footballer before. And so, without anybody quite deciding it should happen this way, George Best is left to navigate almost entirely on his own the strange new territory of being, simultaneously one of the most gifted footballers Britain has ever produced, and one of the most famous young men in the entire country. Manchester in the late 1960s is not London, and it does not have quite the same concentration of clubs and boutiques and fashionable nightlife that the capital has built its swinging reputation on. But George Best, with the money now arriving from endorsements as well as wages, and with an appetite for the good life that grows in direct proportion to his fame, sets about changing that in his own small corner of the city. He opens boutiques, clothes shops carrying his own name, catering to a new generation of young men who want to dress like him, cut their hair like him, walk with something of his easy confidence. He opens a nightclub. He is photographed constantly, not on the football pitch now, but at parties, at premieres, on the arm of one beautiful woman after another. A long and well-documented parade of actresses and models and beauty queens that the tabloids follow with an appetite that seems never to be satisfied. There is a genuine question worth asking here, one that biographers and football historians have returned to again and again in the decades since. Was this life good for him? Did George Best actually want the boutiques and the nightclubs and the endless parade of parties, or was he simply swept along by a current that had become too strong, too fast-moving, for a young man in his early 20s to resist, or even to fully understand? The honest answer, based on everything he said himself in later life, in interviews and in his own writing, seems to be both at once. He genuinely enjoyed a great deal of it. He liked the attention, at least at first. He liked the money, the clothes, the freedom to live in a way that no young man from the Craigie estate could ever have imagined for himself a decade earlier. There was real joy in it, real pleasure, and it would be a disservice to his memory to pretend that all of it was simply suffering dressed up as glamour. But there was something else happening beneath the surface too, something that would take years to fully reveal itself, and that George himself would spend much of the rest of his life trying, and largely failing, to properly understand. The same instinct for freedom and spontaneity that made him unplayable on a football pitch, the refusal to be constrained by a defender's expectations, The willingness to simply go where the moment took him rather than where the coaching manual said he should did not switch off once he left the training ground. It followed him into the nightclubs, it followed him into the parties, and increasingly as the 1960s gave way to the 1970s, it followed him into a relationship with alcohol that would come to define the second half of his life every bit as thoroughly as football had defined the first. Matt Busby, aging now, and increasingly weary of a job that has already asked more of him than most men could give in a single lifetime, tries in his own way to manage the situation. He has genuine affection for George, a paternal warmth that goes beyond the ordinary manager and player relationship, born partly out of the same instincts that made him so patient during those early homesick years in Manchester. But affection is not the same thing as control, and Busby, by his own later admission, finds himself increasingly unable to provide the kind of discipline that might have steered George away from the habits beginning to take hold. It is tempting, looking back from the distance of decades, to want a villain in this part of the story, someone to blame for what starts to go wrong. But there really isn't one. There is simply a 20-something-year-old man of extraordinary natural gifts, thrust into a level of fame that nobody in his position, his industry, or his country had ever experienced before, without any of the support structures that modern sport would eventually develop to help athletes cope with exactly this kind of pressure. No sports psychologists, no media training, no structured programs for managing the specific and unprecedented strangeness of being simultaneously a professional athlete and a national celebrity of the first order. George navigates it as best he can, which is to say, brilliantly on the pitch, and increasingly chaotically off it. He misses training sessions, he turns up late, or occasionally not at all. Stories begin to circulate, some exaggerated by an eager press, others entirely accurate, of nights that stretch far too late, of mornings that begin with considerably less discipline than a professional athlete of his calibre requires. And yet, remarkably, extraordinarily, none of it seems to touch the football. Not yet. Whatever chaos is accumulating in George Best's private life during these years, it has not yet begun to visibly damage the quality of what he produces on a Saturday afternoon. If anything, the football during this period reaches heights that will never again be matched, not by him, and arguably not by very many players in the entire history of the English game. Which brings us to the moment that Matt Busby and the whole of Manchester United, and in a very real sense the whole of English football, had been waiting a decade to arrive at, the moment that would finally answer the question of whether the rebuilding after Munich had been worth all the years of patient, painful effort. May of 1968, Wembley Stadium, London. Manchester United against Benfica once again, the same Portuguese opponents George had torn apart 2 years earlier in Lisbon. Only this time it is the European Cup final itself, the biggest prize in continental club football, and the stakes carry a weight that goes far beyond the ordinary magnitude of a cup final. It is 10 years, almost to the month, since the crash at Munich airport took the lives of 8 Manchester United players and came within a hair's breadth of taking Matt Busby's life as well. For a decade, Busby has carried the rebuilding of this club as something closer to a personal mission than an ordinary job, and reaching a European Cup final, the tournament in which the original Busby Babes had been competing when tragedy struck, carries an emotional significance that every single person connected with the club understands, without needing it explained. Bobby Charlton, one of the survivors of that crash, walks out at Wembley that evening carrying the memory of teammates who never had the chance to grow old, never had the chance to see this night for themselves. It is impossible to overstate what this match means to him personally, and by extension to Busby, and to the entire institution of Manchester United Football Club. The match itself does not begin as the romantic, triumphant occasion that the occasion perhaps deserves. Benfica are a serious side, disciplined and dangerous, and for long stretches of normal time the game is tense and cagey, each team wary of the other's capacity to punish a mistake. Bobby Charlton opens the scoring with a header in the first half, a goal of real quality that briefly threatens to settle the match. But Benfica respond, drawing level in the second half, and as the 90 minutes tick down toward their conclusion, the possibility of the entire occasion ending in bitter disappointment hangs uncomfortably over Wembley. Then, deep into the closing stages, comes a moment that very nearly changes football history in the wrong direction entirely. Eusebio, the great Benfica forward, breaks clear with only the goalkeeper to beat. The kind of chance that a player of his quality scores far more often than he misses. For a fraction of a second, It looks as though Manchester United's dream is about to be shattered in the cruelest possible fashion, deep in a final that means more to this club than any other match in its history. But the goalkeeper, a big, commanding Northern Irishman, makes a magnificent save, and instead of wheeling away in celebration, Eusebio does something that becomes, in its own quiet way, one of the most sporting gestures in the history of the European Cup final. He walks over and applauds the goalkeeper for the save, a gesture of pure respect between two great professionals in the middle of the most important match of both their careers. The match goes to extra time, and it is here in those additional 30 minutes, with the exhaustion of a full 90 minutes already in every player's legs and the emotional weight of the entire occasion pressing down on both sides, that George Best produces the moment the whole of Manchester United has been waiting for. He receives the ball inside the Benfica half, and with the tiredness of extra time slowing almost everyone else around him, George seems, if anything, to find an extra gear rather than lose one. He drives forward, past one defender and then another, the same low centre of gravity and impossible balance that had terrorised defences since he was a teenager on the Craigie estate, now doing exactly the same thing on the biggest stage European football can offer. He rounds the goalkeeper with an ease that borders on the cruel, and rather than simply passing into an empty net from a difficult angle, in a moment that reveals something of his flair even in the most pressured circumstances imaginable, he takes an extra touch to make absolutely certain before rolling the ball home. Manchester United lead. The goal breaks Benfica, and further goals follow in the remaining minutes of extra time from Brian Kidd on his 19th birthday, and from Bobby Charlton again, sealing a 4-1 victory that, by the final whistle, has become something considerably larger than a football result. When the whistle finally sounds, the scenes at Wembley are extraordinary. Grown men in the crowd and on the touchline in tears, because everybody present understands exactly what this achievement represents. Manchester United, 10 years on from the darkest night in the club's history, are champions of Europe. Matt Busby, who was given the last rites twice in a German hospital in 1958, has lived to see his rebuilt team reach the very summit of the European game. For George Best, personally only 22 years old that night, it represents the absolute peak of his career, the moment when every gift he had shown as a boy on the Craig estate, every piece of skill he had taught himself against a gable wall in Belfast, comes together on the largest possible stage to help deliver the club's greatest ever triumph. Later that year, he is named European Footballer of the Year, an individual honour that confirms, if confirmation were even needed by this point, that he is recognised not merely as the best player in England, but as the finest footballer on the entire continent. It should have been the beginning of an even longer, even more decorated career. A player of this quality, at this age, with this club, winning this trophy, ought to have gone on to collect league titles and European Cups and individual honours for another decade at least. Instead, 1968 turns out to be the peak of the mountain, not a staging post on the way to somewhere higher. What follows in the years immediately after this extraordinary triumph is one of the most painful and well-documented declines in the history of British sport. Matt Busby retires from management not long after the European Cup triumph, stepping back from the day-to-day running of the team he has spent more than 2 decades building and rebuilding. It is on paper a natural and well-earned conclusion to one of the great managerial careers in football history. In practice, for George Best, it removes the one relationship at Manchester United built on genuine patience and paternal understanding, the one senior figure at the club who had shown, time and again since George was a homesick 15-year-old, a willingness to make allowances that a more conventional manager would never have made. The managers who follow Busby do not have that same relationship with George, and do not have in most cases the same patience for behaviour that increasingly falls short of what a professional footballer's discipline is supposed to look like. Wilf McGuinness, promoted from within the coaching staff, struggles to command the same authority that Busby had, and struggles in particular to manage a dressing room containing several ageing stars from the European Cup winning side, alongside a talismanic forward whose off-field habits are becoming harder and harder to ignore. The drinking, which had been a background feature of George's life for several years already, tucked in among the boutiques and the nightclubs and the general excess of celebrity life in the late 1960s, begins to move steadily into the foreground. Missed training sessions become more frequent. Stories of nights that run long into the morning become harder for the club to simply wave away as tabloid exaggeration, because increasingly they are not exaggerations at all. There is a particular tragedy in the timing of all this, because George is still, even as his discipline deteriorates, playing football of a quality that very few players in the world can match. The talent has not disappeared. If anything, in flashes, it burns as brightly as it ever did. Moments of skill and vision that remind everyone watching exactly why this man was, only a couple of years earlier, crowned the finest footballer in Europe. But the consistency that elite-level football demands, the week-in, week-out professionalism that even the most gifted players need in order to sustain a career at the top, becomes increasingly difficult for him to provide. Franco Farrell arrives as manager in the early 1970s and, like McGuinness before him, finds himself unable to build the kind of relationship with George that might have arrested the decline. Stories from this period paint a picture of a football club that genuinely does not know what to do with its greatest asset, torn between the football justification for accommodating a generational talent and the increasingly obvious cost to team discipline and to George's own well-being of continuing to do so. It would be easy telling this part of the story to focus purely on the disappointment of watching such a talent begin to fade before its time, but it is worth pausing to consider what was actually happening beneath the surface, because the language available at the time, in newspapers and in football dressing rooms alike, simply did not have the vocabulary that a modern understanding of addiction would provide. Alcoholism in the early 1970s is widely understood, even among educated and otherwise compassionate people, as a matter of willpower and character rather than as the illness that medical understanding would later recognize it to be. George is not, in the language of the era, sick. He is undisciplined. He is wasting his talent. He is letting people down. These are the words used about him in print and in private, and they carry a moral judgment that a diagnosis of illness simply does not carry. George himself, in later years, would speak with remarkable honesty about how little anyone around him, including himself, understood what was actually happening during these years. He was not a man choosing carelessness over discipline out of simple selfishness. He was a young man in the grip of something that nobody in his immediate circle, however much they cared about him, had the tools or the understanding to properly address. The stories that accumulate through the early 1970s become steadily more serious. There are disappearances, days when George simply does not turn up, anywhere, and the club and the press alike are left to speculate about where he has gone. There are reconciliations and fresh starts, each one greeted with genuine hope that this time will be different, and each one in time giving way to the same patterns reasserting themselves. Through all of it, the football world continues to hold out hope, because the talent is simply too extraordinary to write off. Every time George returns from one of these episodes and produces a moment of brilliance on the pitch, a mesmerising dribble, an outrageous piece of skill, a goal that reminds everyone exactly what he is capable of, it becomes a little bit harder for anyone connected with Manchester United to make the difficult decision that the situation increasingly seems to demand. But eventually, in the January of 1974, that decision effectively makes itself. George Best plays his final match for Manchester United on the 1st of January 1974 against Queen's Park Rangers. He is 27 years old. 27, an age at which most elite footballers are entering the very peak of their physical and footballing prime, an age at which careers are supposed to be reaching their fullest maturity rather than reaching their conclusion. There is no single dramatic incident that ends his Manchester United career, no one unforgivable act of misconduct that forces the club's hand. It is rather the cumulative weight of years of missed training, missed matches, and a relationship between player and club that has simply exhausted itself on both sides. George stops turning up. The club, no longer willing or able to continue accommodating a situation that has become untenable, eventually accepts that the relationship has run its course. It is worth sitting for a moment with the strangeness of this. A man recognised only 5 or 6 years earlier as the finest footballer on the entire European continent, walking away from the biggest club in England before he has even turned 30. There is no injury forcing his departure, no obvious footballing reason why this should be happening. There is only the slow, grinding weight of a struggle that nobody around him, including George himself, has yet found a way to properly address. What follows is often described in the histories written about his career as the wilderness years, and the phrase is apt. George does not simply retire and disappear from football entirely. He continues playing, in fact, for the best part of another decade, but the trajectory is now unmistakably downward. A slow scattering of appearances for a long list of clubs that reads almost like a map of a career in freefall, each stop a little further from the game's summit than the last. He turns out for Stockport County, then Cork Celtic in Ireland, then Los Angeles Aztecs in the fledgling North American Soccer League, a competition that in the mid-1970s is still trying to establish itself as a genuine footballing product in a country where the sport has never held mainstream appeal. There is something almost gentle about this period of his career, a sense of a man finding, briefly, a kind of peace in a country far removed from the intense scrutiny of the British press, playing a version of the sport that carries considerably lower stakes and considerably less pressure. California, in particular, seems to offer George something like the closest thing to contentment he experiences during these turbulent years. The pace of life is slower. The football, while a significant step down in overall quality from the English top flight, still allows him to demonstrate flashes of the brilliance that made him famous in the first place. And American crowds, largely unburdened by the weight of British football history, greet him with a straightforward, uncomplicated appreciation for a genuinely great player gracing their fledgling league. It is in this period that he meets Angie Janes, an American model, and the two marry in 1978. For a while there is real hope, both from George himself and from those who care about him, that a settled family life in America might provide the stability that English football, with all its associated pressures and temptations, had never quite allowed him to find. But the pattern that had established itself in Manchester does not disappear simply because the postcode has changed. The drinking continues, sometimes worse, sometimes better, but never fully resolved. Following George from California back to England and to a string of further clubs, Fulham, where he briefly rekindles some of his old creative partnership alongside a similarly maverick teammate, then Hibernian in Scotland, then further spells in the North American game with Fort Lauderdale Strikers and San Jose Earthquakes, and eventually a return to lower league English football with Bournemouth. Watching footage from this period is a genuinely bittersweet experience. There are still moments, even into his 30s, when George Best receives the ball and something of the old magic reasserts itself. A drop of the shoulder, a change of pace, a piece of skill that reminds everyone watching exactly who they are looking at. But these moments arrive now against a backdrop of visibly declining fitness, of a body no longer capable of sustaining the extraordinary demands his talent once made look effortless, and of a private life that continues to unravel in ways that become increasingly difficult and increasingly painful for the public to ignore. Throughout these years, George is remarkably honest, in interviews and in his own writing, about what is happening to him. He does not, for the most part, hide behind excuses or attempt to blame others for his situation. He speaks with a self-awareness that is in its own way deeply affecting, describing the pull of alcohol in terms that make clear he understands exactly what it is costing him, even as he remains unable for long periods to break free of it. There is a particular kind of tragedy in watching a person understand their own downfall with total clarity and still be unable to stop it, and George Best's story through these middle years of his life is exactly that kind of tragedy, played out not in private but in the full glare of a public that had once adored him without reservation, and now watches, with a complicated mixture of sympathy and disappointment, as one of the most gifted footballers Britain has ever produced struggles against something far harder to defeat than any defender he ever faced on a football pitch. George retires from professional football in the early 1980s, still only in his mid-30s, an age at which many footballers of more modest talent are still playing at a reasonably high level. What follows is a further 2 decades of a life that becomes increasingly defined by his relationship with alcohol, rather than by anything connected to the sport that made him famous in the first place. He works for periods as a media pundit and after-dinner speaker, trading on the fame and the goodwill that his footballing genius had built up over the years, and by most accounts he is genuinely good at this kind of work when he is able to commit to it, charming and self-deprecating, and possessed of the same easy natural charisma that had made him so magnetic as a young footballer. But the pattern of his life during these years remains fundamentally unstable, periods of sobriety and apparent recovery interrupted, again and again by relapses that undo whatever progress had been made. His first marriage to Angie ends in divorce, worn down by years of a struggle that neither party had the tools to fully overcome. He marries again to Alex Percy in 1995, and for a period this second marriage seems to offer, once more, the possibility of stability, of a life finally brought under some measure of control. In the mid-1990s, the physical cost of decades of heavy drinking begins to show itself in ways that can no longer be managed privately or explained away. George is diagnosed with liver disease, the direct and well-understood medical consequence of the pattern that had defined so much of his adult life. And the diagnosis marks the beginning of the final, most painful chapter of his story. What is remarkable about George Best during these years, and what distinguishes his story from so many other tragic accounts of addiction among famous and talented people, is the degree of honesty with which he continues to discuss what is happening to him. He does not retreat from public view, or attempt to manage his image through denial. He speaks repeatedly and with real candor about the nature of his addiction, about the specific mechanics of what alcohol has done to his life and his body, in a way that goes well beyond what most public figures of his era were willing to say about their own struggles. In 2000, he undergoes surgery for his liver condition, and for a period afterward there is genuine cause for hope, a sense that this medical crisis might finally provide the wake-up call that decades of personal struggle had not been able to produce. George speaks publicly about wanting to live, about wanting to be a father to his son Callum, about understanding now, with total clarity, exactly what continued drinking would mean for the remainder of whatever life he has left. But the illness of addiction, as George himself understood better than almost anyone by this point, does not respect good intentions, however sincerely they are held. Despite the surgery, despite the public promises, despite what appears to be a genuine desire to change, the drinking resumes. It is a pattern that anyone who has witnessed addiction up close will recognize immediately, and one that a public increasingly educated about the realities of alcoholism, partly through George's own candid interviews, comes to understand not as a moral failing, but as a genuine, devastating illness. By 2005, George's health has deteriorated to a point that makes his situation impossible to ignore. He is admitted to hospital in London in the autumn of that year, suffering from multiple organ failure, the final consequence of a battle that had, in one form or another, occupied more than 3 decades of his adult life. The tabloid press which had followed George Best's every move since he was a teenager, from the glamour of the 1960s through the long, difficult years of decline, now follows his final illness with the same relentless attention, printing daily updates on his condition, photographing the hospital where he lies. It is, in its own way, a fitting and uncomfortable bookend to a life lived almost entirely in public view, a life in which private struggle and public spectacle had never really been allowed to exist separately. In one of his final public statements, released from his hospital bed, George Best offers a message intended for young people, a warning about the dangers of the path his own life had taken. "Don't die like me," he says, in words that are reprinted in newspapers around the world, a final act of honesty from a man who had spent much of his adult life being honest about his failings, even when it would have been easier, and considerably more comfortable to hide from them. George Best dies on the 25th of November, 2005, at the age of 59 in a London hospital, surrounded by the complications of an illness that had, in the end, proven impossible to outrun. He was 59 years old, and he had been for a period of years that now felt achingly short, the finest footballer that these islands had ever seen. Before we go any further into what happened after his death, it is worth pausing here, in the quiet, to properly consider what George Best actually was as a footballer, because it is easy in a story that contains so much sorrow to let the sorrow crowd out the sheer, uncomplicated wonder of the talent itself. Those who played alongside him, and those who played against him, tend to describe the same handful of qualities whenever they are asked to explain what made him different. His balance is mentioned again and again, an almost supernatural ability to stay upright through challenges that would have sent most players sprawling, a low centre of gravity that let him absorb heavy contact and simply continue moving as though nothing had happened. Defenders would commit everything to a tackle, timing it as well as they possibly could, and George would simply still be there afterward, ball still at his feet, moving in whatever direction he had already decided to go. There is a particular quality to the way he dribbled that separates him from other gifted dribblers of his own and later eras, where some players use pace to simply outrun defenders in a straight line, and others use close control to shield the ball and wait for an opening, George did something closer to improvisation, reading a defender's weight and momentum in real time, and choosing, in the smallest of margins, exactly the wrong direction for that defender to be moving in. It was less like watching a plan being executed and more like watching a conversation, George asking a question with his body and the defender, almost every time, giving the wrong answer. He was equally comfortable with either foot, a rarer quality in football than casual observers sometimes appreciate, and it meant that defenders could never safely force him onto a supposedly weaker side, because no such side reliably existed. He was strong in the air for a player of modest height, a product of impeccable timing rather than simple physical power, and he possessed, throughout his peak years, genuine pace, capable of accelerating away from defenders who had, moments earlier, believed themselves close enough to make a challenge. Perhaps the most remarkable single passage of individual skill in his entire career came in February of 1970, in an FA Cup match against Northampton Town, a lower league side entirely unequipped to cope with what United's forward line, and George in particular, were about to do to them. Manchester United win the match 8-2, and George Best personally scores 6 of them, a total that remains to this day one of the highest individual goal tallies ever recorded in a major cup competition in English football. What made that performance remarkable was not simply the number of goals, but the range of finishes involved: headers, close-range taps, a looping effort from distance, each one demonstrating a slightly different facet of his game, as though he had decided, on this particular afternoon, to offer a complete demonstration of everything he was capable of doing with a football. Teammates speak of training ground moments that never made it into any match report, but that live on in the memory of everyone who witnessed them. Extraordinary pieces of skill, performed apparently for his own amusement, tricks and flicks that had no tactical purpose, beyond the simple pleasure of doing something difficult with total ease. There is a story, repeated in slightly different versions by different witnesses over the years, of George dribbling past a goalkeeper in a practice match, and then, rather than simply rolling the ball into an empty net, stopping the ball dead on the goal line and waiting for a defender to arrive, before nutmegging him as well, purely for the joy of it. This playfulness is, in many ways, the essential key to understanding George Best as a footballer. Unlike some of the great discipline technicians the game has produced, players whose brilliance emerges from relentless repetition and tactical discipline, George's genius always retained something of the boy on Craigor Road, playing not because a coach demanded it, but because the ball at his feet was, quite simply, the most enjoyable thing in his entire world. Opposing managers, forced to prepare their teams to face him, spoke of the particular impossibility of the task. You could double mark him, and he would simply draw 2 players out of position and create space for a teammate. You could man-mark him with your most physical defender, and he would use that physicality against the defender, absorbing the contact and continuing forward regardless. There was, by the honest admission of manager after manager across more than a decade of English football, no reliable way to stop him. You could only hope on any given afternoon that his mind was elsewhere, and even then, more often than not, it was not. Pelé himself, a man not given to lightly praising rival talents, once described George Best as the greatest player in the world, a judgment echoed by numerous other legends of the game across several different footballing generations. It is a testament to the specific, undeniable quality of his talent that this judgment has never really been seriously disputed, even by those who point, quite reasonably, to the tragedy of what that talent was never allowed to fully become. There is a particular sadness, sitting alongside all of this wonder, in knowing that the very qualities that made George Best magical on a football pitch, the refusal to be constrained, the instinct to follow the moment wherever it led, the total lack of interest in doing things the conventional or expected way, were the same qualities that made discipline off the pitch so agonizingly difficult for him to maintain. The genius and the difficulty were never 2 separate things happening to the same man. They were, in the truest sense, the same thing, viewed from 2 different angles. It is impossible to tell George Best's story properly without returning, for a while, to Belfast, and to the particular and painful history of the place he came from, during the very years when his fame was at its height. From the late 1960s onward, Northern Ireland descends into a prolonged period of sectarian violence and political conflict that comes to be known, with a grim understatement typical of the region, as the Troubles. bombings, shootings, and civil unrest become a grinding feature of daily life across the province, dividing communities along religious and political lines that had existed for generations, but that now express themselves through open and often deadly conflict. Belfast itself, the city where George grew up, becomes one of the focal points of this violence, and the Craigie estate where he learned to play football against a gable wall exists. For much of this period, within a city fundamentally reshaped by fear, checkpoints, and division, it is a strange and difficult thing to hold in your mind alongside the glamour of George's life in England during these same years, the boutiques and the nightclubs and the tabloid headlines, because the contrast between the two realities, the one he left and the one he was living, could hardly be more extreme. George played for the Northern Ireland national team throughout much of his career, earning dozens of caps for a country that, during these years, had relatively little to celebrate on the international stage, its small population and modest football infrastructure, meaning that even a golden generation of talent could rarely compete with the larger footballing nations of Europe. Northern Ireland did not qualify for a major tournament during George's international career, and there is a genuine lasting sadness among Northern Irish football supporters that the finest player their country ever produced never had the opportunity to display his talents on a World Cup stage. But within the context of Northern Ireland itself, George's importance went well beyond results on the pitch. In a society increasingly and painfully divided along sectarian lines, George Best occupied a rare and valuable position as a figure who commanded genuine, near-universal affection across the divide. Protestant and Catholic communities, otherwise separated by walls both literal and figurative, could agree, without qualification, on their pride in this one footballer, a son of the Craigie estate who had gone out into the world and become, by common and largely undisputed consent, one of the greatest players the game had ever produced. It would be an overstatement to suggest that football alone could heal the deep wounds of a society in the grip of sustained political violence, and George himself never claimed any such grand unifying role for his own career. But there is something genuinely significant in the fact that, throughout the worst years of the Troubles, his name remained one of the very few things that Belfast, in all its painful division, could speak about with a single unified voice. George's own relationship with his home city during these years was complicated by the same forces that complicated everything else in his life. He returned to Belfast periodically throughout his career, and was by every account deeply and permanently attached to the place, to his family, to the particular rhythms and humour of the city that had shaped him. But the demands of his football career, and later the chaos of his personal struggles, kept him based primarily in England and for a period in the United States, and the physical distance from home became, in its own quiet way, another loss layered on top of everything else that his fame had already cost him. There is a particular kind of loneliness that comes from being celebrated everywhere, except in the place where you most want to belong, and though George Best was never short of admirers wherever he went, the pull of Craigie Road, of the particular streets and accents and unspoken understandings of home, seems to have remained with him throughout his life, a quiet ache beneath the surface of a career and a life lived, for the most part, a long way from Belfast. Northern Ireland's football community and the wider city of Belfast never stopped claiming him as their own, through every difficult headline, every relapse, every painful chapter of his decline. He remained, whatever else was happening in his life, unmistakably and permanently a son of that city, and Belfast, in turn, never once let go of its pride in him, a loyalty that would express itself, in the end, in one of the most remarkable public outpourings of grief that the city, and indeed the whole of the United Kingdom and Ireland, had witnessed in a generation. George Best possessed, throughout his life, a rare and disarming gift for self-deprecating honesty, a willingness to describe his own failings with a wit that made even his most painful admissions strangely, uncomfortably enjoyable to listen to. He is remembered for a number of lines that have long since passed into the wider culture, quoted by people who may know very little else about his career, precisely because they capture something so vivid and so honest about the particular shape of his struggle. The most famous of these lines, repeated in countless newspaper obituaries and television retrospectives in the years since his death, runs roughly as follows. He spent a great deal of money on drink and on women and on fast cars, he would say, and the rest he simply wasted. It is a joke, and a genuinely funny one, delivered with the timing of a man who understood exactly how to make an audience laugh, even at his own expense. But underneath the joke sits something considerably less comfortable, an admission of genuine waste, genuine loss, made bearable to say out loud only by wrapping it in humour. This duality, humour wrapped around genuine pain, defines a great deal of how George spoke about his own life in the years after his football career had effectively ended. He gave interviews, wrote autobiographies, appeared on chat shows, and in almost every one of these public appearances there is the same pattern, a natural, easy charm that audiences responded to warmly, sitting directly alongside an unflinching honesty about addiction, about failed relationships, about a career that fell dramatically short of its full potential. There is a particular and often quoted observation, attributed to the football writer and broadcaster Michael Parkinson, who interviewed George on several occasions across different decades and watched with evident sadness the visible toll that the years took on a man he had first interviewed as a dazzling young star. Parkinson noted that George Best remained, throughout everything, one of the most naturally likeable men he had ever met, someone whose charm survived even the worst years of his decline, which made the tragedy of his situation, if anything, more difficult to witness rather than less. The relationship between George and his old teammates from the great Manchester United sides of the 1960s remained, for the most part, warm and enduring, even as his personal circumstances grew increasingly difficult. Bobby Charlton, a man of considerable personal reserve who rarely spoke in public about the private struggles of teammates, nonetheless expressed, on numerous occasions over the years, a genuine sadness about what had happened to George, tempered always by an equally genuine admiration for the football that George had produced during their years together at Old Trafford. Denny's Law, the third member of that celebrated Holy Trinity, maintained a friendship with George across the decades that survived every difficulty, every disappointment, every public relapse, a loyalty rooted in the shared understanding that only teammates who had actually shared a dressing room with him could fully appreciate. The understanding of exactly how extraordinary George Best had been, and exactly how much the football world had lost when his career effectively ended a decade or more before it reasonably should have. It is worth pausing here to consider a question that George's story raises again and again, a question that football, and indeed society more broadly, has continued to wrestle with in the decades since his death. Do we, in some sense, create the very tragedies we later mourn by celebrating and rewarding exactly the qualities in gifted young people that make eventual self-destruction more likely? George was rewarded, from a very young age, for exactly the instincts that would later prove so difficult to control, his refusal to conform, his willingness to follow impulse rather than convention, his total comfort with a level of attention that few young men could reasonably be expected to handle without support. Nobody around him, in the football establishment of the 1960s and 70s, had the tools, the language, or in many cases the genuine understanding to intervene in a way that might have changed the outcome. This is not an excuse offered on George's behalf, and it is not intended to remove any of the personal agency and personal responsibility that adulthood inevitably carries. But it is a context worth understanding, because it explains why a story containing so much genuine warmth, so much affection from teammates and fans and even from journalists who covered his every misstep, could still end in the way that it did. George Best was, in the truest and most complete sense, both things that people said about him. He was the most naturally gifted footballer these islands had ever produced, and he was a man whose life was shaped and ultimately shortened by an illness that the era he lived through simply did not know how to properly treat. Neither truth diminishes the other. Both, held together, are the only way to understand him honestly. George Best's funeral takes place in Belfast on a Saturday at the beginning of December 2005, and what happens on the streets of that city on that particular day becomes, in its own right, one of the most remarkable moments in the entire story. An estimated 100,000 people line the route of the funeral procession, filling pavements and pressing against barriers in numbers that overwhelm even the most optimistic expectations of the organisers. They come from every part of Northern Ireland, from every community, from both sides of a divide that had for more than 3 decades defined so much of daily life in the city George was born into. On this day, that divide simply does not appear to matter. Protestant and Catholic, Unionist and Nationalist, people who might never otherwise have stood shoulder to shoulder at any other public event in the city's recent history, gather together in a shared and entirely unified expression of grief and pride. The scenes are broadcast around the world, and commentators struggling to find an adequate comparison reach for the language usually reserved for the passing of genuine national figures, heads of state, monuments of culture rather than footballers. It is, in its scale and its emotional intensity, a funeral that speaks to something considerably larger than football itself, a recognition that George Best had, across his complicated and often painful life, come to represent something to the city of his birth that went well beyond his statistics on a football pitch. The service itself, held at Stormont, the seat of Northern Ireland's Parliament, is attended by former teammates, football dignitaries and members of his family, and the eulogies delivered speak, with evident and unforced emotion, of a man whose talent had been extraordinary and whose personal struggles had been, in their own way, equally extraordinary. Two halves of a single life that nobody present attempts to separate or simplify. In the years that follow, the city of Belfast moves, gradually and thoughtfully, to memorialise its most famous son in ways that will last considerably longer than any single funeral procession. Belfast City Airport, the smaller of the city's two airports, is renamed George Best Belfast City Airport, an honour that places his name permanently at the gateway through which visitors arrive in and depart from the city he never fully left behind, whatever the geography of his actual career might have suggested. A statue is erected, a mural, one of many that already decorate the walls of Belfast, a city with a long tradition of using public art to mark its history and its heroes, depicts George in the full flow of his footballing genius, a permanent reminder, on the actual streets where he learned the game, of what the boy from Craigar Road became. Fans continue even decades later to visit these memorials, to lay flowers, to take photographs, to tell their children and grandchildren about the man who was there before either Diego Maradona or any of the more modern superstars of the global game, doing things with a football that nobody had quite seen before. There is a particular phrase that attaches itself to George Best in the years and decades after his death, repeated so often in pub conversations and football arguments across Britain and Ireland, that it becomes something close to a piece of folk wisdom. Maradona good, Pelé better, George Best. The chant goes, sung by supporters who understood, instinctively, that any serious conversation about the greatest footballers who ever lived had to include this one particular name from this one particular Belfast estate, regardless of how the trophies and the statistics might have compared across different eras and different countries. It is a fitting, if imperfect, tribute, because George Best's legacy was never really about trophies and statistics in the way that some players' legacies are. It was about something harder to measure and considerably more enduring, the specific, unrepeatable joy of watching a genuinely singular talent express itself without restraint, and the equally unrepeatable sorrow of watching that same talent struggle against forces that no amount of skill on a football pitch could ever have been enough to overcome. There is a part of George Best's story that receives, understandably, rather less attention than the football and the fame, but that carries a weight of its own, quietly present beneath everything else that happened across his very public life. It concerns his family, the people who watched from Belfast, and later from closer quarters, as the boy they had raised became one of the most famous men in the world, and then watched, with a particular and private anguish that the newspapers could never fully capture, as that same boy struggled against a darkness that would eventually claim more than just his career. George's mother, Anne, was by every account a woman of real warmth and strength, the steady centre of a household raising 6 children on modest means in Belfast. What is less widely known, and what adds a further layer of sorrow to the whole story, is that Anne herself developed a serious drinking problem in the years after George became famous, a struggle that would eventually contribute to her own death in 1978, when George was still only in his early 30s. The exact relationship between a family's shared vulnerability to alcoholism and the specific pressures that fame brought into the Best household is not something that can be reduced to a simple explanation. Addiction runs through families for reasons that combine genetics, environment, and circumstance in ways that even now are not fully understood by medical science. But there is something undeniably poignant in the fact that George, who spent so much of his adult life battling the same illness that had already claimed his mother, carried this particular burden not as an isolated personal failing, but as something that had in some sense already visited his own family before it fully took hold of him. His father Dickie, a quieter and more private figure than his famous son, remained a steady presence throughout George's life, watching from Belfast as his eldest child navigated a level of fame and difficulty that nothing in either of their lives had prepared them for. Dickie Best gave occasional interviews over the years, always measured, always protective of his son, even during the periods when George's behaviour made that protection difficult to offer without qualification, and his quiet dignity throughout decades of difficult headlines stands as its own kind of testament to a family that never stopped loving their son, however publicly complicated his struggles became. George's own experience of fatherhood adds a further layer of both hope and heartbreak to the story. His son Callum, born during his marriage to Angie in California, became, particularly in George's later years, one of the most important relationships in his life, a source of genuine motivation during the periods when George attempted, sincerely and repeatedly, to overcome his addiction. Callum has spoken in the years since his father's death about both the warmth of their relationship and the particular difficulty of growing up as the son of a man whose struggles played out so completely in public view, a version of childhood that comes with none of the normal protections that most children are afforded from their parents' private difficulties. There is something worth sitting with here, a reminder that behind every public story of addiction and decline, however much that story becomes shorthand for a particular kind of celebrity tragedy, there exists an entire private world of people who loved the person at the centre of it, who watched helplessly as things went wrong, who carried their own grief and worry largely out of the public eye even as the tabloids printed every detail of the more visible chapters of the same story. George Best's family never stopped claiming him, never stopped loving him, never reduced him, in their own private accounting, to the headlines that so often defined how the wider world understood his life. To them, he remained, throughout everything, simply George, the boy who couldn't be parted from a ball. The eldest of 6 children in a modest house on the Cregger estate, a son, a brother, eventually a father himself, carrying all of that ordinary private humanity underneath the extraordinary and very public story that the rest of the world came to know him by. Let us slow down for a while and sit inside a single afternoon, because it is in the smallest, most specific details of George Best's football that his genius is easiest to properly feel, easier than any list of trophies or statistics could ever make it. It is 1971 at Old Trafford, and Manchester United are playing Sheffield United on an ordinary league Saturday, the kind of fixture that history does not usually remember, the kind of afternoon that exists for most players in most matches, simply as one instalment in a long, repetitive season. George receives the ball wide on the right, a defender already goal side of him, already set in the kind of defensive stance that a well-drilled fullback adopts when facing a dangerous winger, weight balanced, eyes fixed on the ball rather than the man. What happens next takes only a handful of seconds, and yet if you slow it down, frame by frame, the way football historians and old teammates have done so many times in the decades since, you begin to see just how much is actually happening inside those seconds. George shifts the ball from his right foot to his left and back again, twice, in a motion so quick that the defender's body, already committed to reading the first movement, has no time to properly process the second. It is not speed in the conventional sense, it is something closer to sleight of hand, translated into the language of feet and legs rather than fingers and cards. The defender lunges, as defenders are trained to do when a forward's balance appears, for a fraction of a second, to have shifted too far in one direction. But George's balance has not actually shifted anywhere near as far as his body language has suggested. This is the essential trick, repeated across an entire career, in one match after another, against one defender after another, none of whom ever seem quite able to learn from the mistakes of the players who faced him before them. He shows you one thing with his shoulders and his hips, and does another thing entirely with the ball, and the gap between those two things, however small, is exactly wide enough for him to pass through. The defender is beaten, not embarrassed in some cruel, exaggerated way, simply beaten, the way a good defender is occasionally and unavoidably beaten by a player operating on a different plane of skill entirely. George continues forward, the ball still perfectly under his control, and delivers a cross of genuine precision into the box, met by a header that puts Manchester United ahead. It is not, by the standards of his career, a particularly famous goal or a particularly famous piece of skill. It does not have a nickname the way the 6 goals against Northampton do, or the way certain other moments in English football history have earned themselves permanent titles in the collective memory of the sport. It exists, largely, in old footage and in the memories of the crowd who happened to be at Old Trafford on that particular Saturday, One small, perfect example of a talent that produced dozens, if not hundreds, of comparable moments across a career that, even in its diminished later years, kept offering flashes of the same impossible quality. This, perhaps, is the truest way to understand what made George Best so different from almost every other footballer of his generation, and arguably of any generation since. It was not simply that he could produce moments of brilliance in the biggest matches, against Benfica in Lisbon, at Wembley in a European Cup final, though he certainly did both of those things and more besides. It was that the brilliance was, in some sense, constant, present in the small, unremarkable Saturday afternoons, every bit as much as in the enormous occasions that history chose to remember. A talent so deeply embedded in the way he moved and thought about the game that it simply could not switch itself off, regardless of the size or significance of the stage he happened to be playing on. Think about what that must have meant week after week for the defenders whose job it was to stop him. There was no complacent afternoon to look forward to, no fixture where you could reasonably expect an off day from the man wearing the number 7 shirt. Every single time George Best received the ball, in every single match across more than a decade of top-level football, there existed the genuine possibility that something extraordinary was about to happen, and defenders across the entire English First Division learnt, over those years, to live with a particular and specific kind of dread that very few other players in the history of the English game have ever been able to inspire with such total consistency. In the years since George Best's death, football as an industry has changed in ways that make his particular story feel, in certain respects, like a document from an almost unrecognisable era, even though barely 2 decades separate his final months from the world of the modern professional game. Football clubs today employ sports psychologists as a matter of course, professionals whose entire job is to understand and support the mental and emotional well-being of players who face pressures that, while different in their specific texture, echo many of the same underlying challenges George faced without any comparable support. Media training is standard practice for young players entering professional academies, an explicit acknowledgement that the transition from ordinary teenager to public figure requires preparation that simply did not exist in any organised form during George's own rise to fame in the 1960s. There is a reasonable argument, made by numerous football historians and sports psychologists in the years since his death, that George Best's story played a genuine role in shifting the culture of professional football toward taking these issues more seriously. His honesty, during his own lifetime, about the realities of addiction, delivered without the shame and secrecy that had previously surrounded such struggles among public figures, opened a conversation that professional sport has continued to have, with increasing sophistication and compassion, in the decades since. Other footballers, in the years following his death, have spoken openly about their own struggles with mental health, with addiction, with the particular and unusual pressures that come with extreme youthful fame, and many of them have credited George's own candour, however painful the circumstances that produced it, with making that kind of honesty feel more possible for those who came after him. It is a strange and bittersweet form of legacy, a man whose personal struggles, rather than being simply a private tragedy, became, through the sheer scale of his fame and the honesty with which he discussed them, a genuine catalyst for a more compassionate and better informed approach to athlete welfare across the entire sport. It is worth returning here briefly to the comparison that this whole story invites, the comparison to the boy from Buenos Aires whose own tale of genius and self-destruction unfolds a continent away and a full generation later. Diego Maradona and George Best never faced each other in a competitive match of any real significance, their careers separated by roughly a decade at their respective peaks, but their stories rhyme with each other in ways that football historians have returned to again and again. Both were extraordinarily gifted working-class boys who rose from modest, difficult beginnings to become the most celebrated footballers of their entire generation. Both found the transition from ordinary life to overwhelming global fame considerably more difficult to navigate than the transition from amateur to professional football. Both struggled for the whole of their adult lives against addictions that the football world around them was frequently unable, and in some cases unwilling, to properly address, and both in the end died before their time, mourned by entire nations, remembered as much for the beauty of what they gave to football as for the sorrow of everything that beauty eventually cost them. There is something almost universal in this particular shape of story, repeated across different decades and different countries and different footballing cultures, and it is worth asking honestly what it says about the sport itself and about the wider human tendency to celebrate exactly the qualities in gifted people that make their eventual struggles more likely, without building, until it is often too late, the structures of support that might help them survive their own gifts. George Best would likely have resisted, with characteristic humour, any attempt to turn his life into a straightforward moral lesson. He was, throughout his life, wary of being reduced to either the romantic, tragic genius of popular myth or the cautionary tale that public health campaigns sometimes wanted to make of him. He was simply a man extraordinarily gifted in one particular way and extraordinarily vulnerable in another, living a single, complicated, deeply human life in which both of those truths were present at every single stage, from the tarmac of Cregger Road to the hospital bed in London where his story finally came to its end. Documentaries and retrospectives have continued to appear in the years since his death, each one introducing his story afresh to a generation of football supporters who never had the chance to see him play live, who know him only through grainy highlight reels and the testimony of those old enough to remember. It is a particular kind of immortality, this passing down of a footballer's genius through second-hand memory and archive footage, and it speaks to something enduring about George Best specifically, that his story continues to feel worth retelling decade after decade, to audiences who were not even born when he last kicked a ball in anger. There is a version of George Best's story that lives almost entirely in daylight, in stadiums and photographs and newspaper front pages, in the roar of Old Trafford, in the flash of cameras outside nightclubs. But there is another version, quieter, less often told, that exists in the hours after the crowds have gone home, and it is worth spending a moment there before we move any further. Picture George, some evening in the late 1960s in a Manchester flat that money and fame have furnished considerably better than the terraced house on Cregger Road ever was. The boutique he owns is closed for the night. The nightclub crowd has moved on to wherever it moves on to at that hour, and George is alone in the way that even the most surrounded and celebrated people can find themselves entirely alone, with nothing but his own thoughts and the particular restlessness that seems never to fully leave him, whether he is on a football pitch or off one. Those who knew him during these years describe a man who found stillness difficult, who seemed happiest in motion, whether that motion was expressed through the extraordinary skill of his dribbling, or through the relentless social whirl of parties and clubs and late nights that increasingly defined his life away from football. It is tempting to wonder whether the two things were, in some sense, connected, whether the same restlessness that made him unplayable on a pitch, the refusal to stay still, the compulsion to keep moving toward whatever came next, also made ordinary stillness, ordinary quiet evenings, unusually difficult for him to simply sit inside. There is a particular kind of loneliness that belongs specifically to extreme fame, one that is difficult for people who have never experienced it to fully understand. It is not the loneliness of being unwanted or unloved, because George, throughout these years, was wanted and loved by more people, in a more immediate and visible sense, than almost anyone else in the country. It is instead the loneliness of being seen constantly and known rarely, of moving through a world where nearly everyone recognises your face and almost nobody, beyond a small circle of family and old friends from Belfast, actually knows who you are underneath the face. George spoke in later interviews about this particular difficulty with more insight than people often gave him credit for. He understood, looking back, that the version of himself the public fell in love with, Beatle, the fifth Beatle, the glamorous young genius photographed on the arm of one beautiful woman after another, was in some ways a performance, a role that had grown up around him faster than he had been able to properly inhabit it, until the line between the performance and the person underneath became increasingly difficult, even for George himself to locate. The drink in this reading of his story becomes something more than simple excess or simple weakness. It becomes, at least in part, a way of managing a gap between the person he actually was, the working-class boy from a Belfast housing estate, who had once been happiest kicking a ball against a gable wall in the fading evening light, and the person the entire world now expected him to be, glamorous, endlessly charming, permanently at the centre of whatever party or headline the moment demanded. This is not offered as a complete explanation for everything that followed, because addiction, as we have already discussed, resists complete explanation and reduces itself to no single tidy cause. But it offers, perhaps, a way of understanding why a man with every material advantage that fame and wealth could provide might still find himself, in the quiet hours after the cameras had gone home, reaching for something to numb a particular kind of discomfort that none of that fame and wealth had actually been able to resolve. There were, throughout these years, genuine moments of peace too, and it would be wrong to paint the whole of George's private life as unrelieved struggle. Old teammates recall a man capable of real warmth and generosity, quick to laugh, genuinely delighted by simple pleasures, a game of cards, a joke shared in the dressing room, a phone call home to Belfast that could lift his mood for days afterward. The tragedy of George Best's life was never that he was incapable of happiness. It was that the happiness, however real and however frequently it appeared, existed alongside a struggle that never fully released its grip, one that would, in time, come to define the public understanding of his life more thoroughly than any of the joy that ran alongside it. It is important, as we move toward the end of this story, to hold both of these things in mind together: the joy and the struggle, the genius and the illness, the boy who never stopped loving a football, and the man who could never quite find his way to the peace that boy had once found so easily on an ordinary street in Belfast. Amid the long, difficult decline of George Best's later playing career, there are moments that stand out precisely because they interrupt the general downward trajectory with something warmer, something closer to the old joy, and one of the most affectionately remembered of these moments belongs to his time at Fulham in the mid-1970s. Fulham, a modest London club without any great history of challenging for major honours, signed George in 1976, by which point his Manchester United career is already several years behind him, and his reputation, in strictly footballing terms, is that of a fading star rather than a rising one. But something unexpected happens at Craven Cottage, the club's small and famously picturesque riverside stadium, something that briefly recaptures a measure of the old magic and reminds an entire generation of supporters exactly what they had been missing. Fulham, in a moment of what can only be described as inspired eccentricity, also signed Bobby Moore during this same period, the England captain who had lifted the World Cup a decade earlier, another great name from the previous era now approaching the end of his own playing days. The pairing of Best and Moore in Fulham's forward and midfield areas produces a spell of football that, while it never threatens to deliver major silverware, brings a genuine and infectious joy back to a club that had rarely had cause for this kind of excitement. Crowds at Craven Cottage swell noticeably during this period, supporters coming not necessarily to see Fulham win, though they enjoy that too when it happens, but simply to see two authentic legends of English football sharing a pitch together in the twilight of their respective careers, still capable, on their better afternoons, of the kind of moments that reminded everyone why these two men had once been household names across the entire country. There is something genuinely moving about this period, a reminder that even amid genuine tragedy, life rarely proceeds in a single, uninterrupted downward line. George, during his Fulham years, seems by most accounts happier and more settled than he had been for some time, enjoying the relatively lower pressure environment of a club with modest ambitions, enjoying the company of Moore, whose own quiet dignity and professionalism seemed to have had a stabilising effect, at least for a while, on George's own approach to the game. It does not last, of course, in the way that none of the periods of stability in George's life ever quite lasted, but it stands in the broader arc of his story as proof that the joy he had always found in football, the pure and uncomplicated pleasure that had first drawn him to a ball on the Craig estate as a small boy, never entirely disappeared, however difficult and however diminished the surrounding circumstances of his life had become by this stage. Fans who were present at Craven Cottage during this period still speak of it with genuine warmth decades later, describing an atmosphere that felt less like watching a declining star going through the motions and rather more like watching two old friends, two men who had given everything to the game they loved, simply enjoying a final shared chapter together before the inevitable conclusion of their playing careers arrived. It is worth remembering moments like these, amid a story that contains so much genuine sorrow, because they complicate any temptation to view George Best's later career purely through the lens of tragedy. There was decline, undeniably, and there was struggle, painfully and publicly documented, but there was also, right up until the very end of his playing days, genuine football, genuine skill, and genuine moments of the old joy breaking through. Flickers of the boy from Craigar Road who had never really left, however far the man he became had travelled from that narrow Belfast street. Let us go back for a while to where this all began, because it is only by returning there that the whole shape of the story becomes properly visible. Picture that same narrow street in East Belfast, decades earlier now than anything we have just described, the small boy still barefoot or nearly so, still kicking a ball against the gable wall of his family's house, with a concentration that seems, even then, to belong to someone considerably older than his years. He does not know in this moment anything about Manchester or Lisbon or Wembley. He does not know about European Cups or Footballer of the Year awards, or sombrero photographs or newspaper headlines calling him El Beatle. He does not know about boutiques or nightclubs, about Los Angeles or California sunshine, about hospital wards in London or funeral processions lined with 100,000 mourners. He knows only the ball, and the wall, and the particular satisfaction of watching the ball come back to him, at exactly the angle he expected, over and over, the small private triumph of a boy who has, without any coach or any formal instruction, already begun teaching himself something that the whole of world football will eventually stop and marvel at. There is a version of this story, and it is worth holding on to as we approach its end, in which none of what came later, the fame, the fortune, the boutiques, the tabloid obsession, the addiction, the decline, none of it actually changes what was happening in this earlier, simpler moment. The boy and the ball and the wall were real. The satisfaction he found there was real, uncomplicated, and entirely his own, untouched by anything that would happen to him later. Everything that came afterward, every triumph and every difficulty, grew outward from this same root, this same simple relationship between a boy and a ball that asked nothing of him except that he keep playing, keep experimenting, keep discovering what his own body was capable of on a stretch of ordinary tarmac in an ordinary Belfast street. The genius that dazzled Lisbon and Wembley was the same genius, simply grown larger and more refined, that first announced itself in that small, private, repetitive ritual against a gable wall that nobody outside his own family was even watching. And perhaps this is the most important thing to understand about George Best, more important, in the end, than any of the specific details of his rise or his fall. The joy he brought to millions of people, the specific and unrepeatable pleasure of watching a player do things with a football that nobody had quite done before him, was never manufactured or performed for an audience. It began, and in some essential sense it always remained, exactly what it had been on that first evening against the gable wall. A boy, entirely alone, finding something in the relationship between his own feet and a leather ball that felt, more than anything else in his life ever would, completely and simply like home. The struggles that followed, the addiction, the decline, the painful public unravelling of a talent that deserved so much more time at its peak than it was ultimately given, none of this erases that earlier truth. It exists alongside it, the way genuine sorrow so often exists alongside genuine joy in the fullest and most honest accounts of any human life. George Best contained both. He always had. The boy against the wall and the man in the hospital bed were never two different people. They were the same person at two different points along the same continuous line, carrying the same restless, brilliant, ultimately vulnerable spirit through every stage of a life that gave the world more joy and asked of its owner more cost than almost any other footballing story of the entire 20th century. Somewhere in the quiet of an ordinary Belfast evening, long before any of the rest of it happened, a small boy is still out there in the fading light, the ball still coming back to him off the wall at exactly the angle he expected, and for a little while longer, before the whole world discovers him, none of what comes next has happened yet. There is only the boy and the ball and the particular, private, uncomplicated happiness of a street where, for now, that is all that matters. If you were to lay out the honours of George Best's career on a page, the way football statisticians and historians periodically do, you would find a record that is, by the standards of the very greatest players the game has produced, curiously incomplete, a list that hints at magnificence without ever quite representing the full scale of it. 2 league championships with Manchester United, one while he was still a very young man establishing himself in the first team, 1 European Cup, the crowning achievement of 1968, 10 years after Munich, the night that meant more to the club than any other victory in its history, 1 Ballon d'Or, the European Footballer of the Year award, claimed in that same golden year, confirming his status as the finest player on the entire continent at the peak of his powers. Beyond that, the trophy cabinet, remarkably for a player of his ability, remains largely bare, a reflection not of any shortage of talent, but of a career that effectively ended a full decade before it reasonably should have, and of a supporting cast, in the years after Munich's brightest stars began to age, that was rarely strong enough to deliver the sustained team success that George's individual brilliance deserved. Compare this record to some of his contemporaries and successors, players who accumulated championship after championship, continental medal after continental medal, across careers that stretched deep into their 30s, and George Best's actual haul of silverware looks, on paper, almost modest. But nobody who watched him play, and almost nobody who has studied the history of the sport in any serious depth since, has ever suggested that this modest trophy count reflects anything like the true measure of what he was capable of, or what he actually achieved in the years when his talent burned at its brightest. This is, perhaps, the central and defining paradox of George Best's entire legacy. He is remembered, discussed and revered not primarily through the conventional currency of trophies and statistics that football usually uses to measure greatness, but through something else entirely, a collective cultural memory of moments, of feelings, of the specific and irreplaceable sensation of watching a talent so far beyond the ordinary that it seemed, at times, to be playing an entirely different game to everyone else on the pitch. Journalists who covered football across the decades that followed his retirement would return to him again and again as the benchmark against which subsequent generations of gifted dribblers were measured. This player has a touch of the George Best about him. That piece of skill was pure George Best. A shorthand that required no further explanation because everybody, across an entire country and beyond it, understood exactly what quality was being invoked. Few footballers in history have had their name transformed so completely into an adjective, a unit of measurement for a particular kind of footballing beauty that existed before he arrived only in fragments, and that he gathered together, for a golden decade at Old Trafford, into something whole and complete and genuinely without precedent. There is a version of history in which George Best plays on, largely unaffected by the difficulties that actually shaped his life, accumulating trophies and records deep into his 30s the way some of his contemporaries did, retiring as statistically and undeniably the greatest player these islands had ever produced by every conventional measure available. That version of history did not happen, and there is real and lasting sadness in knowing it did not happen, in knowing exactly how much more football the world was denied by the illness that claimed so many of his best remaining years. But the version of history that did happen, however painful in its particulars, produced its own kind of completeness, a story that carries a different but no less powerful kind of weight than uninterrupted triumph would have carried. George Best's career, taken as a whole, joy and sorrow together, genius and struggle inseparable from one another, tells us something true and important about talent, about fame, about the particular vulnerabilities that come bundled together with extraordinary gifts, and about a football culture that took decades to properly learn how to protect the very players it most needed to protect. That lesson, learned at enormous personal cost to George himself, has outlived him, shaping, in ways both direct and indirect, how professional sport now thinks about the well-being of the young people it entrusts with such extraordinary talent. It is not the legacy he would have chosen given the choice, but it is, in its own difficult way, a legacy worth having, and one that ensures the story of George Best will continue to be told and to matter for a very long time to come. It is a legacy written not in medals, but in the quiet, ongoing work of a sport slowly learning to look after its own. There is a particular shirt number that has, in the years since George Best wore it, taken on a significance at Manchester United that goes well beyond the ordinary business of assigning squad numbers to players. The number 7, worn by George throughout the peak years of his career, has become, at Old Trafford, something closer to a title than a simple number, handed down across the generations only to players the club believes capable of carrying the particular weight of history attached to it. Brian Robson wore it in the 1980s, a midfielder of enormous energy and leadership, who captained the club through some of its more difficult years, before the trophies began arriving again in earnest. Eric Cantona wore it in the 1990s, a mercurial Frenchman whose flair and unpredictability, and occasionally his temperament too, carried more than a passing echo of the player who had worn the shirt a generation earlier. David Beckham wore it after Cantona, a player whose fame would, in its own way, come to rival and even exceed George's own, translated into a genuinely global celebrity that the era of satellite television, and the internet made possible in ways 1960s Britain could never have imagined. And then, in the early 2000s, a teenage Portuguese winger arrives at Manchester United and is handed that same number 7 shirt, a young man named Cristiano Ronaldo who will go on to become, by any reasonable measure, one of the 2 or 3 greatest footballers of the entire modern era. Ronaldo has spoken, on numerous occasions throughout his career, about his awareness of exactly whose number he was being asked to wear, about studying old footage of George Best as a young player in Manchester, trying to understand something of the tradition he had been asked to continue. There is something genuinely moving in this unbroken thread, stretching from a homesick 15-year-old boy who twice ran back to Belfast before finally settling into life in Manchester, through decades of extraordinary individual talent, all the way to a modern game transformed almost beyond recognition by money and television and global reach, and yet still, in its own way, paying tribute to the player who first made that particular shirt number mean something more than simple squad administration. George himself, in the years before his death, watched some of this new generation of talent with obvious appreciation, offering praise for players like Ronaldo with the same generous eye that had once made Pele's own compliments toward George so meaningful within the game. There is a natural fraternity among footballers who have reached the very summit of individual skill, a mutual recognition that transcends generation and era, and George, whatever the difficulties of his own life, never lost his genuine and uncomplicated love for watching great football played well by whoever happened to be playing it. It is worth remembering too that the number 7 shirt has never been treated lightly at Old Trafford, precisely because George Best set a standard for what wearing it could mean, both as a promise of extraordinary skill on display and, more quietly, as a reminder of the particular pressures and vulnerabilities that can accompany even the most spectacular talent. Every player who has worn that shirt since has done so in the shadow, welcome or otherwise, of the man who first made it iconic, a permanent and living connection between the modern global spectacle of the sport and a boy who once had nothing more than a gable wall and an ordinary Belfast street to practice on. Football has a long memory, longer in some ways than any other form of popular entertainment, precisely because it passes its history down through shirts and numbers and stadiums and stories told across generations of supporters who never saw the original moments themselves, but who have absorbed them anyway, through grainy footage and the retelling of parents and grandparents who did. George Best's number 7 belongs to that long memory now, permanently, a small but enduring piece of the way Manchester United understands itself, and a quiet, continuing tribute to the Belfast boy who first gave that shirt its particular weight and meaning. So here, at the end of the night, is where we leave him. Not in the hospital bed in London, surrounded by the final complications of an illness that had followed him for most of his adult life. Not in the tabloid headlines that chronicled every difficult chapter with an appetite that never seemed to tire. Not even in the 100,000 mourners lining the streets of Belfast, though that image of a divided city united for one single afternoon in grief and pride deserves to be remembered too. Let us leave him instead somewhere quieter, Old Trafford, an ordinary training morning sometime in the middle 1960s, before the fame had fully arrived, before Beatle and the boutiques and the difficulties still waiting further down the road. George is on the training pitch, doing something with a ball that makes the older professionals around him stop what they are doing and simply watch, the way people always stop to watch, from the very first afternoon on the Cragger estate through to the very last flickers of his career in America and at Craven Cottage. Think about the whole shape of it. A boy from an ordinary Belfast street who could not be parted from a football, who taught himself entirely alone against a gable wall, a version of the game that no coach could have shown him, and that the whole world would eventually come to recognise as one of the purest expressions of footballing genius the sport has ever produced. A young man who conquered Lisbon before he had turned 20, who lifted the European Cup at Wembley 10 years after the tragedy that very nearly ended Manchester United altogether, who was named the finest footballer in the whole of Europe while still barely into his 20s. And a man too who struggled, for the whole of his adult life, against an illness that the era he lived through did not have the language or the tools to properly understand, who lost a career that should have lasted another decade, who caused himself and the people who loved him a great deal of genuine pain, and who spoke about all of it, in the end with a rare and disarming honesty that the world has not always been generous enough to fully credit him for. Both of these men were George Best. Neither one existed without the other. The same restless, brilliant, uncontainable spirit that made him unplayable on a football pitch made discipline and moderation almost impossible for him to sustain everywhere else. And if you take away one half of that equation, you lose the other half along with it. There is no version of George Best who wins every trophy and lives a long, quiet, uneventful life, because the very thing that made him extraordinary was never separable from the thing that made him vulnerable. Football has given us other geniuses since, other players whose talents seem to arrive from somewhere beyond ordinary explanation, and football will surely give us more again in the years and decades ahead. But there was only one George Best, only one boy from Cregger Road who became, for a golden handful of years, the most watchable footballer these islands have ever produced, and whose story, joy and sorrow woven together so completely that neither one can be properly understood without the other, continues to be told in pubs and living rooms and quiet conversations between people who never saw him play and people who remember every single minute of it. Somewhere tonight, in the part of Belfast where a small boy once kicked a ball against a gable wall until the light was completely gone, there are still people who remember him exactly as he was before any of the rest of it happened. Just George, a boy with a ball and a wall and an entire unwritten life still waiting patiently in front of him. Let that be the picture you carry with you as you drift off tonight. Not the headlines, not the hospital bed, not even the trophy raised above his head at Wembley in the warm glow of a European triumph, a decade in the making. Just the boy, and the ball, and the particular, private joy of a talent finding itself for the very first time, on an ordinary street, in the fading light of an ordinary Belfast evening. That joy was real. It never stopped being real, however difficult the years that followed it turned out to be. And it is that joy, more than anything else, that Belfast still carries for him, that Manchester still carries for him, that football itself still carries for him. Every single time somebody, somewhere, drops a shoulder past a defender and, just for a moment, reminds an old crowd of a boy who could do it better than anyone else alive. Rest now. Let all of this settle. The stadium lights have dimmed, the crowds have gone home, but the stories never stop. Sleep well, Georgie.